CJNG, or the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, has become officially the most powerful cartel in all of Mexico, with control in all 32 states. I'm Katarina Schultz. This is Borderland Dispatches, an Ironclad original. CJNG is now categorized as the most militarized and expansionist cartel. The DEA has officially said, and we've seen that this was already clear, that their stronghold is in all 32 Mexican states. Their weaponry, their propaganda, and their psychological warfare absolutely goes beyond borders and has transcended every aspect of Mexican and organized crime societies in a way. As of 2023, and keep in mind, this is prior to the infighting that began in Sinaloa and the new alliance formed between the Chapitos and the CJNG. But as of 2023, the US said that CJNG has ties in 48 countries. This has become a worldwide transnational organized crime group. And they really flex their muscles when it comes to showing just how much power they have. We hear this, just like I talked about in the last episode, in the music. We see this on social media. And most importantly, we're seeing this in the headlines, in the way that CJNG has managed to sink their claws into Mexican government at every level, and also Mexican and US society and pop culture. It's absolutely insane considering how its origin story didn't really begin that long ago. CJNG was founded in 2010 by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, or as we all know him to be, El Mencho, who has faked his death multiple times. So have many of his family members. He is allegedly somewhere in hiding in a mountainous region and likely very sick of cirrhosis due to excessive drinking. I believe El Mencho is certainly alive. I think without him, the CJNG would not be gaining so much power at the rate that they are and be so violent. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the reason they've managed to garner this level of power is due to their origin story, their extreme violence, and their Robin Hood perception that they've managed to build in Mexico by helping lower income communities and rural communities, giving out gifts. I mean, just on Mother's Day this year, they ran this whole sort of like project initiative where they had these banners of El Mencho in certain smaller regions in Mexico, and were giving out Mother's Day gifts, money, groceries. And as we've seen before, like you look back at Pablo Escobar's time, these initiatives really work with a lot of vulnerable people and impressionable people. There are a lot of people who view these groups as their government. I mean, in reality, a lot of the regions in Mexico are governed by CJNG, especially considering how much power they hold across the entire state. You're telling me that if they're going out and doing good, literally, it's just objective social aid for a lot of people who need it, that these people aren't going to support them, protect them, keep quiet? Of course they are. Now, El Mencho was a Mexican police officer. He worked in law enforcement, and he has deep ties to Jalisco and Michoacan. Jalisco, of course, it's the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, is the birthplace of this violent cartel. Jalisco, Michoacan, Nayarit is basically the three-state region where CJNG in the early 2010s swooped in, and after beating La Resistencia, which was the sort of Sinaloa armed aligned group of the Millennial Cartel, CJNG really started to grow. I remember in the beginning seeing how buses were being burned in Puerto Vallarta. A lot of regions across Jalisco were basically under constant warfare, not to the extent that like Sinaloa is right now, for example, but this group, the Halisco Cartel, had their set sight, and they were causing mass destruction on the path to reach their objective, which was, and still is, absolute control and absolute power. And if we look at the state of cartel power dynamics in Mexico right now, it's safe to say, I mean, even prior to the DEA publicly announcing that CJNG has a stronghold across all of Mexico, but even prior to that, it was very safe to say that the CJNG was slowly but surely and violently becoming Mexico's #1 most powerful cartel, perhaps in history. Now, we can't talk about the Halisco Cartel without diving into their hyper-violent messages that they send. First of all, in 2020, they were responsible for one of a few attempts to murder Omar Garcia Haruch, the Secretary of Security in Mexico. Basically, the person in charge of combating the cartels. And there have been multiple attempts to kill this man. He somehow manages to survive them and maintain his authority. But it's very clear that CJNG does not fuck with him, obviously. And so this was one of many very loud and blatant attempts to show Mexican people and various federal governments, whether that be Mexico, the US, wherever, anyone trying to tackle the cartels, that they are not afraid of anything and they're not afraid to lose anything, and they certainly aren't afraid to take a risk and attack the very individuals who are coming for their criminal organization. And so aside from this personalized attack, we also see them taking violence to very extreme levels in terms of their recruitment and public displays of violence. A really good example of this would be an instance that the CJNG publicly denied in one of those press release videos that I always refer to, and I mentioned that in the propaganda video as well. But the Ranchu Seer extermination camp that was found just 60 kilometers outside of Guadalajara. This camp was allegedly run by the CJNG, where kidnapping victims, recruits, voluntary or not, were brought for training, for torture, and for indoctrination. And this camp had evidence of many murders, vicious torture, and, some sort of makeshift training area. Whether this was actually used for a training camp or not is debatable, but were people subject to extreme torture and murdered there? Certainly. I know that there are a lot of conspiracies and a lot of people who believe that this sort of rhetoric or notion that this was a plant, that, this didn't actually happen, that the clothes were set up, it was some sort of political agenda. I believe that a tragedy occurred here, or multiple. The evidence speaks for itself, and the way in which CJNG operates speaks for itself, and leads me to believe that they are entirely capable of doing this. Their recruitment has known to be absolutely vicious. I mean, first and foremost, in terms of recruiting people for their cartel, they're targeting impressionable young people who want to be a part of something, who want to feel power. And these people are brought to rural mountainous regions. A lot of these recruitment camps, these areas, are in the mountains in Jalisco, Michoacan, Nayarit. And there they have to fight to the death. They have to kill childhood friends, rape women, kill animals. Essentially, they are being trained to lose any sense of human feeling that they have. They are being completely dehumanized and turned into absolute machines. And this is working for the CJNG, because if the majority of their associates and operators are trained to view death as something necessary, to view torture as a means of protecting their organization, they will do it. And if these people are really willing to commit the absolute most heinous acts and not even bat an eye, I mean, even if it does affect them, it doesn't matter. What's done is done. But if they become these, killing machines, they will absolutely die and do whatever it takes to maintain the integrity of the CJNG. It essentially operates in a way like a cult, which is why I think it's become so successful. Because if you have the members of your group so deeply indoctrinated to believe that they should die for the cause, what and who could possibly take this down and dismantle it? But how has the CJNG managed to expand their control across all of Mexico? Really, the first time we've seen a cartel do this. First of all, let's talk about the most recent news. As the infighting began within the Sinaloa cartel between El Chapo's faction and El Mayo's faction, the Chapitos were essentially blatantly losing this war. And so CJNG stepped in and said, and I believe this to be pretty much a proxy, they said, we will align with you, we will supply you weapons, your head security guy, who at one point was La Perris, which is now El Jardinero, has to protect El Mencho as well. And we'll help you guys out, but we also get to have control here. When in the world could you ever imagine that these once declared enemies are now sharing territory, defending each other? Look, I don't think that CJNG ops are willing to fight to the death for Chapitos unless they have something to gain. I also don't believe that CJNG is sending any of their top operatives to Sinaloa. I think it's a lot of people fighting on behalf of CJNG for the Chapitos from other fragmented factions of different cartels. And let's talk about that. Because the CJNG has managed to operate a sort of franchise-style model in order to gain this power. They've aligned with fragmented factions of previous operating cartels. Guerreros Unidos, Santa Rosa de Lima in Guanajuato. And the very individuals operating for these groups now operate for CJNG. And so they've managed to take whatever little powerful groups that were once part of a bigger body, bring them into their organization, and leverage these people to want to work for them, to be a part of something greater, but also funding them. And once you're walking into CJNG money, you're probably never turning back, especially if you were operating with an organized crime group that for quite some time was struggling with maintaining their financial pipelines, whether that be due to adversaries fighting against them or simply the organization crumbling in within itself. And CJNG recognized this and took advantage of it, which has helped them gain this unprecedented level of power. Now, aside from also working with and recruiting other members of other cartels or fragmented groups or localized criminal groups. They've also managed to gain power through powerful people, through political authorities. And they do this by infiltrating Mexican elections, local, state, and federal levels. Now let's start federally, because as we know, the most recent Mexican federal election where President Claudia Sheinbaum was elected was the most violent election in Mexican history. Between the sheer amount of candidates that died and the amount of polling stations that were attacked by armed men, had ballot boxes destroyed, voting cards literally completely vanished. The ballot boxes were stolen, lit on fire, the polling stations were shot up. It was an absolute shit show. I mean, I'm not Mexican, so I can't vote, but if I could, I would have been shitting my pants, depending on where I'm living, to go and cast my vote. Because you're literally walking into this undetermined area where maybe someone who has some sort of political agenda is going to come in and try to sabotage the exact polling station you're at. And then what the hell are you supposed to do? I'm so actually shocked that Mexico doesn't have a higher level of voter apathy, because most people should honestly be scared to vote. And I'm not condoning voter apathy. I genuinely, from a human standpoint, how do you go in to participate in your political elections when you know that you could possibly die? In the name of democracy? Question mark? Does that even exist here anymore? Juan Carlos Andrade Magaña, he was part of Movimiento Ciudadano, that party. He was the mayor of a town in Jalisco, Jilotlán de los Dolores. He was on leave to run for re-election, was ambushed and killed in December of 2023. And the region where he was running, it's right like on the Jalisco-Michoacán border, which we know is a hot spot for extreme violence. And at the time, CJNG was advancing into this very area where he was running, which certainly suggested that CJNG forces were active in the exact area of the ambush and responsible. Now, CJNG didn't take accountability for this. And we know that sometimes they will take accountability for certain violent acts. Other times, they will say that they were not responsible, just like Ranchu Seer. And at the end of the day, just because a cartel is telling you, yes, I did this, or no, I didn't, does not mean you should believe them. It's important to look at the evidence and to look at the greater context surrounding the scenario, because in what world would you ever take the word of a cartel who is pushing their own agenda, their own ideologies, and is extremely violent? I mean, at the end of the day, a great example of this would be like, you're believing the boy who cried wolf. Now, aside from their expansion within Mexico, we also know that CJNG has been crazy about their international expansion. We know about the US, we know about Canada. I talk about this extensively and have really been over this in previous episodes. But they've gone beyond that. They have crossed the 7 seas, and they have managed to create smuggling routes, precursor trafficking routes in basically every international corridor. In the US, they have major hubs in LA, Chicago, Atlanta, Texas, Arizona. I mean, you name it. Really, any major hub. And whether that is for trafficking fentanyl, human smuggling, or even hiring people as straw buyers, and also crude oil theft, trafficking, really any illicit activity that they profit off of, they have some sort of hub that benefits whatever the activity is throughout the United States. Brownsville, Texas, great hub for crude oil theft trafficking, stolen crude oil trafficking. Of course, Chicago, Dallas, LA, hot spots for fentanyl and meth trafficking. And CJNG was always known for their meth trafficking. That's kind of how they started, and it really pushed them forward as a powerhouse. And of course, then the shift happened with the fentanyl crisis and that extreme insatiable appetite for the synthetic deadly opioid. In Europe, there's cells operating in Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. This has to do with synthetic drugs, but also cocaine logistics. In Asia, you have operatives in Hong Kong and mainland China, which are mainly to arrange the precursor chemicals. And then throughout South America, there are numerous known strategic alliances between CJNG and Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and this particularly has to do with the cocaine production and human trafficking, which is a major trade for CJNG, and a lot of the operations that we've seen in Mexico where certain nightclubs or strip bars are shut down due to women that are working there having been trafficked, a lot of them are coming from these parts of South America, and it was due to CJNG. CJNG was running these establishments and trafficking these women from these South American countries. And then in Australia, we've been hearing about this a lot. Australia has become in some way a CJNG stronghold. In 2022, Australian police intercepted a $1.2 billion meth shipment that was directly linked to CJNG. And then you also hear these other ideas that they have these tanks and a lot of... and then you hear these other ideas about how the CJNG is maintaining their stronghold in Australia, whether that be those submarines around Australia or certain flight shipments coming in and people that they've hired, Australian nationals that they've hired to run operations for them. The list goes on. And then most recently, in Africa, CJNG activity has been reported. In Nigeria, in Kenya, these have become new smuggling corridors and even places where now they're setting up shop to produce synthetic drugs. Imagine this criminal network spans across basically the entire globe. How the fuck do you actually go about dismantling something like this? I mean, with the Sinaloa cartel, it was, El Chapo fell, and then the U.S. got El Mayo, and then all the fighting started because everyone is power and money hungry, and then that cartel kind of just dissolves within itself. With an organization like CJNG that has leadership like El Mencho, who's extremely under the radar, there's a $10 million bounty on his head in the U.S., and they've managed to expand their reach across the entire world and throughout every social and political component of Mexico. Where do you even start? They're so extremely violent that, honestly, if I'm being completely honest, lately I've been talking about CJNG a lot because they have been gaining extreme power and they're just absolutely next level in terms of the way they run their operations. But I fear, I do. It does make me worried sometimes, the amount of times that those 4 letters come out of my mouth. The estimated revenue of CJNG annually is around $25 billion. And we know that this isn't just attributed to drugs and human trafficking. You can watch my previous dispatch about how the cartels are diversifying their streams of income. And a big one for CJNG is certainly the crude oil theft. That has always existed, but CJNG has managed to tap into it in a way where they are exporting thousands of tons of crude oil into the U.S. to be refined, and certain U.S. refineries are buying it. Smaller U.S. refineries, they're trafficking it into the United States under the guise that it's waste oil. 3 alleged CJNG operatives were actually just sanctioned by the U.S. for doing just this. And they're making so much money off of every single operation they're running. Actually, and I talked about this previously, but the first person who was just arrested and basically charged under the FTO Act, or at least with evidence to support materials to support evidence that they're supporting a foreign terrorist organization. The first person to ever be arrested under this was a woman in El Paso who's allegedly operating for CJNG, smuggling drugs and straw buying for them. So it just goes to show, especially, I would say in this last year where they've had the opportunity, they have absolutely ramped up international strongholds and their abroad operations. And if their incentive is almost $30 billion a year, we would all do the same thing. Well, that's not true because we don't all commit crimes, but that's crazy. $30 billion a year. Of course, you're going to push it to the max. They're going to expand across every continent, recruit as many people as possible, and diversify their revenue into every possible stream. For them, it's a very logical business model. And again, I'm not condoning it. We're just analyzing exactly how these operations have become so successful and so lucrative. Bitcoin and Bitso, whatever you want to talk about, has become basically their main form of money laundering. They're also using remittance apps. I've talked about this too, because money laundering is basically one of the most important operations for the cartels. Because if they can't clean their money, they can't use their money. El Mencho's daughter, Jessica Johanna, was arrested and released from prison, and she actually was said to be, and perhaps still is, said to be the main point of contact for laundering most of CJNG's money. And then not that long ago, El Mencho's son-in-law was arrested in Riverside, California, living in a multi-million-dollar home with one of El Mencho's daughters. This came sort of as a surprise because this son-in-law had actually previously faked his death. And I think that also brought to light that El Mencho likely had faked his death too, and that was when everyone kind of realized. But he's not dead. CJNG isn't just a cartel. It's an alternate system of power. And whether that applies to Mexico, the US, the war on drugs as a whole, or any international criminal organization, CJNG is at the absolute top of their game and is going down, as we watch in real time, in narco history. The level of their operations are unmatched. Their objectives are literally shooting for the stars. And some way, somehow, with the right connections and the right resources, they're doing just that. Aiming for the stars and reaching them. What's important to take away from this is that CJNG is no longer Mexico's problem. It's the world's problem. And until there is some sort of crackdown on this criminal organization that has garnered so much power, so much infamy, and so much support, they will continue to run their operations as effortlessly and even more amped up probably than ever before. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Borderland Dispatches. I'm Katarina Schultz, and as always, see you next time.